Welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. My name is David.
My name's Matt.
And we are the Taylor Rose.
We are indeed. This week we have a surprise for you. A quote.
A quote, yeah. This is Matt's phone. He wants me to read a quote to you. I have claimed that escape is one of the main functions of fairy stories. And, since I do not disapprove of them, it is plain that I do not accept the tone of scorn or pity with which escape is now so often used. Why should a man be scorned if, finding himself in prison, he tries to get out and go home? Or, if he cannot do so, he thinks and talks about other topics than jailers and prison walls. And that is a J.R.R. Tolkien quote. What's the context of that, Matt?
I don't know the context of the wider quote. He's obviously talking about fairy stories. Actually, I might have read that essay. He did an essay on fairy stories and stuff. But the context is, I stumbled across that thinking, fiction, the value of it, and escapism. We've just done a few episodes on sort of being too busy to this. And maybe sometimes in our own talkings on this podcast, our musings, we maybe come across a little bit as, when we're just escaping to Netflix or, out of reality, that might come across as we don't approve of that. And I think there is that element of, certainly in people in the productivity space or maximizing this and that and the other, it's like there's no space or there's no room for escapism.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly in some quarters that is looked down on, and it was back then as well.
Yeah, and I think kind of the context of this is two parts. One is that people think reading fairy stories is an escape, and escape is obviously bad. And two, fairy stories are what we would now call sort of fantasy or sci-fi stories.
Yes.
It's often seen as a lower form of fiction. It's not classic literature. It's not historical fiction. It's not even a detective novel.
Which is massive. Crime.
Why would you want to read about dragons and fairies and elves? And it's sort of seen as a looked down upon genre, shall we say, of literature. So I think there's twofold parts of this. One, generally, fiction can be looked down on by those people you talked about. Two, a fantasy fiction doubly looked down on. And three, that idea of escape, which I think is what you wanted to talk about today. Of like, well, and really Tolkien here is saying, actually, escape is not a bad thing necessarily in and of itself. And maybe we would say, actually, we agree with that because it's that maybe that moderation. We don't want to live our lives escaped from the world. But also, there can be a richness or a joy to immersing ourselves in a story other than our own.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, similar to one of our recent episodes about taking breaks, and escape into a fantasy world through the medium of fiction, through the medium of a story, a good story, actually can then bring us back when we do return, and we have maybe new hope, or we have changed because we have passed through. We're not just purely numbing out and distracting ourselves from the reality in order to put it off forever. We're actually changed through the process. It's kind of that other thing of, if you've read 1,000 stories, you've lived 1,000 lives.
You're full of the quotes today, aren't you? Yeah, no, I've heard that quote before as well, and that idea of like empathy being driven through reading good fiction as well can be there, can be present. So like you said, we are changed by the stories we read and we engage with. So when would you say escape is a suitable thing? I mean, he said if you're in prison, it's all right to like imagine escaping or even to try to escape.
Yeah, exactly. As you were humming away to me before we recorded, the theme of The Great Escape, which is obviously a great movie, film about escaping from prison. And there's that's a great theme in cinema, actually, isn't it?
War camp, I think, wasn't it?
War camp, yeah, prison of war. But like escape from prison is a theme that grips people we watch. I think
Isn't there a whole TV series, Prison Break?
Probably.
Yeah. Anyway, so
I
you
never
were going to
watched
say
it.
you think.
I do
I want to
think.
hear the end of this thought.
Therefore, I am.
Yeah.
Philosophy. I think that it reminds me of a quote. Might have been by Andy Stanley. Not Andy Stanley. Andy Crouch. It's not really a quote, but an observation, and he was noticing someone. It was at an airport, and he just noticed someone, like a teenager beside him, just furiously like tapping at her phone on a social media platform, let's call it, and just constant tapping, swipe tap. And he said it put him in mind of the sort of the rats in an experiment where they're morphine water or something, and he realized, oh, we've moved from a place of just engagement with this stuff to actually exploitation. Well, it wasn't Andy Crouch, it was Mark Sayers. And
so Andy, Mark, here we are.
But we're moving into a place where we are being exploited and our attention is being farmed. And for many, this is feeding that whole picture of overwhelm and busy, and life itself, just getting through the day, for many people can probably feel a little bit like being in prison, or so there needs to be a escape from reality, because the reality is difficult and overwhelming and too much. And so in that instance, we have no end of options of how to escape, but actually maybe a fiction story, a fantasy, where we actually our imagination is being stimulated. We're not just being fed amazing pictures and images and by incredibly powerful media companies, but actually it's words on a page, or maybe hearing, audiobook, and our brains are being stimulated in imagination. I think that is probably a higher form of escape than just sitting and numbing out in front of a screen.
Yeah, I mean that is one of the differences between reading and maybe watching something. Is the words on the page should hopefully be creating pictures in your head, and those pictures come to life and you experience them in a different way than just through your eyes and just watching what is created for you. I suppose it's interesting for me as well, like you said, that grind that so many of us can relate to, of just going and going and going, and it's noisy physically, but also noisy in terms of stimulation as well. And I know in my life I sometimes experience that, I desire that quiet, that slow, that settled. But actually to come from a day where there's been noise and busyness and go straight into, can I just sit here with a hot drink and be, is really difficult.
Yes.
And actually reading sometimes can be the halfway house.
Yeah.
Where I'm putting input in, but it's at my own pace. It's a bit more restful, and then I can put the book down and fall asleep, or or I can just be, and I can rest, and I can make the connections that we've talked about in previous episodes, and settle almost my inner world, my soul. And so sometimes I use reading as that sort of halfway house there. I don't know if it's an escape though.
I like that. Yeah, well, it's interesting. He uses the word escape, and I do think there is an element of, are you escaping from the world in that situation? I don't know, but yeah, there is an element of, I like that, being a halfway house. And there is something about, you hinted at it, the thing about reading, even and above an audiobook, is I am in control of the speed of the information flow. I can either go faster or slower, and maybe the writing will influence that. And so, if it's getting intense in the story, you probably will read a bit quicker. If it's more mellow, you'll maybe slow down. But it counters that thing of you're constantly just trying to drink from a fire hose, which is what maybe interacting with the world of information does often feel like. There's just endless. It is. There's too much. You'll never get to the end of it.
So wait, go back a bit. Are you saying audiobooks don't count as reading?
I'm not saying that. Well, it's obviously not reading in the traditional sense of what the description of reading would be. But I do also think they're valuable. I enjoy sort of a good audiobook. Never enjoyed a bad one. Sorry, that was a bad joke. But yeah.
And if you want to escape that joke, just stop listening right now.
Stop listening and pick up a good book. Perhaps to wrap this up, is there a danger that we can go too far with escaping with fiction and stuff?
I mean, I think the example that comes to me is the 30-year-old male gamer who, spends their time and their money and life in a fictional world.
Yes.
And I think that ties into other things where you can maybe feel more competent in that world than you do in the real world. And so you said it's that examination of that. But actually, when it's tough, it's no bad thing to step into a fictional world, I think. And sometimes you can read a story and, as you said, become empowered by it. Hey, they're struggling with these things. I can do this. I can overcome it. And that could be kind of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I think story, this is the thing, because this is talking about fiction, fantasy, or fairy stories. But stories of any kind have been told through all human cultures as far back as we know, beyond written history. And I think there is that element again of it's not just purely like, okay, just rationally write out your problems and think of a way that you can solve them. It's like, no, like we are entering into, others have gone here, others have faced dragons. It's the Chesterton quote, isn't it? Sorry to bring another quote into this, but he says, fairy stories don't tell children that dragons exist. They already know monsters exist. They tell them that they can be defeated. I quite like that. And I think there is that, it's a function that comes from it. But even if it didn't have a function, would it be wrong? Not necessarily.
So I think we should finish there. That was a really good final thing. You can conquer those dragons, guys. See you next week.